Richard Kelly was a 34-year-old man known for his calm confidence and sharp mind. He owned two flourishing businesses, Sapphire Luxury Hotels and Elite Catering, both built from years of grit and sacrifice. He and his brother George had always been close, their bond forged in childhood when they survived their parents' painful divorce. They depended on each other through tough times, and he often said, "George isn't just my brother, he's my best friend." So when George got engaged, Richard wanted nothing but happiness for him. Before we go deeper, where are you watching from today? Kindly hit like, comment, and subscribe to this channel for more. Richard was thrilled when George shared his wedding plans. He immediately offered his finest hotel as the venue and placed a $65,000 deposit himself, saying it was his wedding gift to him. "You deserve the best, George," he told him with a smile. But behind that excitement, Richard couldn't shake a quiet unease about his fiancée, Agnes, a polished woman from an elite family whose cold eyes never quite matched her smile. Growing up in a small Boston neighborhood, Richard and George learned early how to depend on each other. Their parents' marriage fell apart when Richard was 12 and George was 14, leaving the two boys in the middle of bitter arguments. Their father, Robert, an overworked accountant, was rarely home, while their mother, Linda, struggled to adjust after years as a stay-at-home parent. "We only have each other," George often told him, counting coins on the bedroom floor as they scraped together enough for groceries. That promise, "we only have each other," carried them through the years. George worked construction, taking shifts at the grocery store when they were teens, while Richard balanced school with long hours at a diner. He helped his brother pay for textbooks when he studied hospitality management in college, and George proudly supported him when he became a construction foreman. "You're my hero, Rich," George used to say, beaming whenever he achieved something new. Their bond wasn't just strong, it was sacred. When Richard opened his first hotel, the Sapphire Grand, George was his biggest supporter. He spent weekends fixing walls, finding contractors, and telling everyone about his brother's dream. The hotel flourished, becoming a symbol of Richard's hard work and vision. By 30, Richard owned multiple luxury hotels and a catering company that served high-profile clients. Through it all, he believed nothing could shake their bond. But that faith began to crumble the day George introduced him to Agnes, a woman whose smile hid ambition sharp enough to cut through family ties. From the first moment Richard met Agnes, something about her felt off. She carried herself like royalty, speaking in a tone that made others feel smaller. When George introduced them at a charity dinner, she offered her hand lightly and said, "So you're the one with the hotels? How impressive." Her eyes scanned the room as if looking for someone more important. George, smitten, didn't notice. He laughed, bragging about her sophistication, while Richard forced a polite smile, sensing trouble behind her charm. Soon, George was spending nearly all his time with Agnes. He joined her at country clubs, fancy brunches, and expensive restaurants where waiters treated him like an outsider. He started dressing differently, talking differently, using words like "our kind of people" and "proper circles." When Richard teased him about it, George laughed it off. "You wouldn't understand, Rich. This is her world." Richard smiled weakly, but deep down, he missed the brother who used to eat takeout with him on the floor, planning their futures between bites of noodles. When George told him he planned to propose, Richard swallowed his concern and chose joy instead. "That's amazing news," he said. George described how he proposed on a private beach, with a ring that cost 6 months of savings. She said, "Yes, Rich. I'm the luckiest man alive." Richard congratulated him sincerely, ignoring the unease twisting in his chest. When George mentioned the wedding venue dilemma, Richard smiled. "Why not hold it at the Sapphire Grand? You'll get the family discount, and I'll cover the deposit myself." George hesitated. Agnes had her heart set on the Rosewood or the Peninsula. Her mother says those places attract the right crowd. Richard chuckled softly. The Sapphire Grand was just rated above both of them, remember? Besides, as the owner's brother, you'll get VIP treatment. George promised to discuss it with Agnes, and a few days later he called back. "She'll consider it," he said. But Richard noticed how flat his tone was, as if the decision didn't belong to him anymore. "Don't worry," Richard replied gently. "I'll make it perfect for her." The day Agnes visited the Sapphire Grand with her mother, the atmosphere turned icy. They walked through the ballroom, whispering criticisms under their breath. "Adequate," Agnes said finally. "But the drapes are the wrong color," her mother added. "And these chairs, completely unsuitable for a high-society wedding." Richard kept his composure, suggesting creative adjustments instead of full replacements. George looked uncomfortable, torn between the woman he loved and the sister who had always believed in him. That was the moment Richard realized this wedding would test not just his patience, but his heart. Over the following weeks, Agnes and her mother began sending endless requests. They wanted imported flowers, custom draperies, and chandeliers replaced with crystal ones from Italy. Richard's event manager, Anthony, looked exhausted. "They treat us like servants, sir," he whispered after one meeting. "Should I push back?" Richard shook his head. "Not yet. Let's keep things professional. This is for George." But deep down, he knew he was no longer planning a wedding. He was financing someone else's ego. When Richard officially paid the $65,000 deposit, he signed it off as a family gift. It covered the venue, catering, and rooms for the wedding party. But once the deposit cleared, everything changed. Agnes began excluding him from meetings and tastings, claiming she wanted to avoid a conflict of interest. George defended her. "She just wants perfection, Rich. Don't take it personally." Richard smiled weakly. "I don't mind perfection. I just prefer honesty." But his words went unnoticed. The wedding he had funded was moving forward, without him. Months passed, and Richard still hadn't received an invitation. When he asked George, his brother said casually, Agnes is handling the guest list. Yours is probably on the way." Weeks turned into months and still nothing came. Then one evening his cousin Dana called. "Rich, the invitations are beautiful. That gold lettering must have cost a fortune." Richard's stomach twisted. "You got yours?" he asked quietly. "Of course. Didn't you?" That was the moment he realized. He'd been deliberately left out. The next morning Richard called George directly. "Is there something I should know?" he asked. "Everyone else seems to have their invitations." George hesitated. Agnes thought, "Maybe it'd be better if you didn't attend. She's worried about dynamics." Richard's voice hardened. "Family dynamics. George, I'm your brother, not a scandal." "Please don't make this harder," George whispered. "You wouldn't understand." "No," Richard said softly. "You're right. I don't." When the call ended, he sat in silence, realizing the brother who once promised to always have his back was now protecting someone else's pride. Weeks later, Richard learned from his staff that Agnes had personally reviewed the reception seating chart, and his name wasn't there. "Are you sure?" he asked the coordinator. She nodded, uncomfortable. "She removed your name herself, sir." Anger burned in Richard's chest. Still, he refused to react publicly. "Proceed as planned," he said. "But take detailed notes of every communication from her team." He needed proof, because something told him this was more than disrespect. It was manipulation. And he wasn't about to let anyone play him for a fool. A month before the wedding, their parents arranged a family dinner, hoping to ease tensions. Richard attended reluctantly, his gut already tight. The dinner began politely, but it didn't stay that way. Agnes's mother, with her trademark smirk, said, "It's so refreshing to see people from working backgrounds succeed in business." Her tone dripped with mock praise. Agnes giggled and added, "Running hotels must be exhausting. So many rooms, so many complaints." Richard forced a smile. "It's not exhausting when you love what you do." But his voice trembled slightly with restrained fury. Their father tried to lighten the mood. Richard's hotels are some of the best rated in the state, he said proudly. But Agnes's mother only nodded thinly. Yes, yes. Though there's a difference between serving the elite and being one of them, don't you agree? The insult landed like a slap. Richard met her eyes calmly. True, he replied. And there's also a difference between having money and having class. The table fell silent. George looked horrified, Agnes glared, and Richard simply picked up his glass of water, refusing to back down. That night Richard couldn't sleep. Every memory of his childhood with George replayed in his mind. The nights they counted coins, the promises they made. How had they come to this? The next morning, he received a call from a friend who worked at Agnes's country club. Rich, she said quietly, you should know, Agnes was laughing about you. She said you actually think you'll be sitting with family at the wedding. They're calling you the hotel guy. Richard's chest tightened. Thanks for telling me, he said. But inside something broke. The next day Richard called George again. Am I invited to your wedding or not? He asked bluntly. George sighed. Rich, it's complicated. Agnes's family has expectations. This wedding could open doors for me. Richard's voice was ice. Open doors. You sound like them, not you. People grow up, George said defensively. Maybe you should try it sometime. Richard paused, his heart pounding. So this is who you've become. This conversation isn't helping, George muttered before hanging up. Richard sat staring at his phone, stunned at how easily loyalty had turned into betrayal. 2 days later, Richard received a call from Victoria Hayes, the wedding planner. Her tone was polite but cold. Mr. Kelly, I'm calling regarding your $65,000 payment. The family has decided to cancel your invitation, but they wish to keep the deposit. Richard froze. Excuse me. Yes, she continued awkwardly. They'll be keeping the venue and catering, but your attendance is no longer required. He gripped his desk. And George agreed to this. According to Miss Agnes, yes. A chill swept through him. His own brother had allowed it. But Richard wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Richard took a deep breath, steadying himself. Victoria, he said calmly, please note something for your records. I'm not just George's brother. I'm the owner of the Sapphire Grand and Elite Catering. There was stunned silence on the other end. Oh, Victoria stammered. I wasn't informed of that connection. Richard's voice was level but firm. Then here's what you'll tell them. Unless I receive a formal apology and reinstatement to the guest list by 5 p.m. today, their event is cancelled, and all deposits are forfeited under Section 12 of the contract. Victoria gasped. You have that authority. Completely, Richard replied, his tone like steel. After ending the call, Richard stood in his office, breathing hard. Anger burned inside him, but it wasn't wild, it was focused. For months, he'd tolerated Agnes's arrogance for George's sake. But this was the line. They had used his money, his business, and his kindness, then turned around and erased him like he was nothing. Not anymore. As the afternoon went on, his phone lit up with calls from George, then Agnes, then their parents. He ignored them all, calmly returning to his budget meeting as though nothing had happened. By 4:45 p.m., chaos had erupted in the hotel lobby. George, Agnes, and both families arrived together, their faces flushed with anger and panic. Richard instructed his assistant to lead them into the conference room, not his office. This is business now, he said quietly. When he entered the room, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Agnes's face was streaked with tears, her mother's lips were tight with fury, and George looked like a man torn between guilt and fear. What is the meaning of this? Agnes's father thundered. You can't cancel our wedding. I can, Richard replied evenly. And I have every right to. The contract clearly states that the Sapphire Grand reserves the right to cancel any event that violates our company's ethical standards. Excluding the venue owner from an event while keeping his payment qualifies. Agnes's mother scoffed. Oh please. You offered that money as a gift. Richard's jaw clenched. A gift built on trust, and you broke it. George tried to intervene. Rich, calm down. This is a misunderstanding. Is it? Richard snapped. Then tell me, George. Why was I uninvited? George stared at the carpet. It wasn't my idea, he murmured. Victoria Hayes, standing quietly in the corner, spoke up. I was instructed directly by Miss Agnes to rescind Mr. Kelly's invitation. Agnes turned on her. You didn't have to say that. Victoria straightened. I did. The truth matters. Agnes's mother waved dismissively. This is ridiculous. Call his bluff. There are plenty of other venues. Richard folded his arms. With 10 days' notice in peak season, you're welcome to try. But you'll forfeit the deposit and pay full price elsewhere. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's mother finally broke the tension. George, is this true? You let them exclude your own brother. George's face flushed red. It's not that simple, Mom. It's exactly that simple, Richard said coldly. You took my money and let them erase me from my own property. Agnes burst into tears. You can't do this. The wedding is next week. And you should have thought of that before insulting the person making it possible, Richard said sharply. You wanted a statement wedding? Here's one. Actions have consequences. Agnes's father, trying to regain control, asked carefully. What would it take to reinstate the booking? Richard met his gaze. 3 things. A sincere written apology, full inclusion as family, and acknowledgement in the wedding program that my contribution was a gift from a loving brother, not a business discount. Agnes's mother sneered. That's blackmail. No, Richard replied calmly. That's boundaries. Learn the difference. His father, watching proudly, murmured, That's my son. The atmosphere shifted. For the first time, George looked truly ashamed. I'm sorry, George said quietly. I should have defended you. I let them convince me that appearances mattered more than loyalty. His voice cracked. You were always there for me, and I betrayed that. Richard's expression softened slightly. You can fix it, George. Choose what kind of man you want to be. Agnes looked at him in disbelief. You're seriously taking his side after everything? George straightened his shoulders. He's my brother. And he's right. Agnes's face twisted with rage. Then maybe you should marry him instead. The room went silent. Richard sighed and turned toward the door. I'll give you until tomorrow to decide, he said evenly. If I don't have the apology in writing, the wedding is off. Agnes's father nodded solemnly. You'll have it. As the families filed out, George lingered. Rich, he said softly, I'm sorry. I don't know who I became. Richard looked him in the eye. Then find the man you were. Because that's the brother I miss. George nodded, tears glistening in his eyes before he left the room. The next morning, an email arrived with a formal apology signed by both George and Agnes. George's part was heartfelt. Agnes's felt forced, but it met the terms. Richard allowed the wedding to continue. His staff, proud of his courage, worked harder than ever to make the event flawless. When the rehearsal dinner came, George greeted him warmly, hugging him tight. You look sharp, Rich, he said. I'm proud of you. Richard smiled faintly. No, George. I'm proud of you for remembering who you are. But deep inside, he wondered if the wedding day would bring peace, or one final storm. The day before the wedding, tension buzzed through the Sapphire Grand like static. Staff whispered that the bride's mother had been barking orders at everyone again, and the decorators were on their 3rd redesign of the ballroom. Still, Richard kept his cool. When George stopped by his office looking anxious, Richard asked gently, You all right? George exhaled. I should be happy, Rich. But something feels wrong. It's like I'm losing myself. Richard clasped his shoulder. Then maybe it's time to ask what kind of marriage you want. One built on truth or one built on fear. The rehearsal dinner that evening was beautiful but stiff. Agnes floated through the room like a queen, her laughter high-pitched and hollow. Richard arrived in a crisp navy suit, drawing surprised glances. Agnes offered him a tight smile. "Glad you could make it, Richard. Wouldn't miss my brother's big day," he said evenly. Throughout the night, he noticed George watching Agnes closely. Her impatience with the servers, her subtle digs toward guests she deemed beneath her. Richard said little, but he could see the conflict rising in George's eyes. Something was changing. After dinner, Richard stepped outside to the hotel terrace for air. The night was cool, city lights glittering below. A few minutes later, George joined him. "You remember when we used to sit on the fire escape and dream?" George asked quietly. "Yeah," Richard said with a small smile. "You wanted to build skyscrapers, and I wanted to run a hotel with a garden." George laughed softly. "Funny how far we've come, and how lost I feel now." Richard looked at him carefully. "Maybe the problem isn't where you are, it's who you're standing next to." George's expression grew serious. "You think I shouldn't marry her?" Richard hesitated. "I think you already know the answer." George rubbed the back of his neck. "Canceling now would be humiliating. Everyone's flown in. Deposits are paid." Richard's voice softened. "A broken wedding is painful. A broken life is worse." They stood in silence as the wind moved through the terrace. For the first time in months, Richard saw his real brother, the one who used to walk him to school and promise they'd always have each other. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and beautiful. The sapphire grand shimmered with white roses and golden light. Guests filled the hall, cameras flashing, the string quartet playing softly. Richard sat in the front row beside his parents, feeling both pride and dread. When George walked to the altar, his steps were steady but his eyes distant. Then the music shifted, the bridal march. Agnes entered, radiant in lace and diamonds. The room gasped. Everything looked perfect until the minister reached the words, "If anyone has reason this couple should not be joined, speak now or forever hold their peace." George looked up, his gaze finding Richard's. Something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, truth, courage. Then George spoke. "I have something to say." Gasps filled the room. Agnes froze, bouquet trembling. "George," she whispered. He took a deep breath. "I can't do this. Not like this." The crowd murmured. "I've been pretending to be someone I'm not, chasing approval I don't need. The only person who ever taught me what loyalty means is sitting right there. My brother." He turned toward Richard, eyes glistening. "And I almost lost him because I forgot who I was." The minister stepped back, unsure what to do. Agnes's face twisted in disbelief. "You can't be serious," she hissed. "We're getting married." "No, Agnes," George said quietly. "You're getting married to an idea. I'm done pretending." He turned to the guests. "This wedding is cancelled." A collective gasp echoed through the hall. Agnes burst into tears, her mother shouting about humiliation and lawsuits. George ignored them, walking straight toward Richard. "You were right," he said softly. "Better to lose face than lose yourself." Richard stood and pulled him into a hug. Outside the ballroom, chaos erupted. Guests whispering, vendors panicking, Agnes sobbing in fury. Richard led George to his office, away from the noise. For a long time they sat in silence. Then George laughed shakily. "Well, that'll make headlines." "Maybe," Richard said, smiling faintly. "But you'll sleep better tonight." "I already do," George admitted. "I thought this wedding would prove I'd made it. But I realize now, you can't measure worth in invitations or last names." Richard nodded. "You just proved something far bigger, integrity." Weeks passed. The scandal faded, replaced by quiet healing. George repaid what he could of the wedding costs and returned to his construction firm. His old confidence began to return. One afternoon he met a woman named Sarah, a city planner who treated everyone with kindness. When he introduced her to Richard, she smiled warmly. "I've heard a lot about you, Mr. Kelly, the brother who saved the day." Richard laughed. "He exaggerates. But as they shared dinner that night, he could see peace settling back into his brother's life. Months later, Richard sat in his office at the Sapphire Grand, reviewing the quarterly reports. Business was booming, but something else mattered more. Family dinners, laughter, honesty restored. George and Sarah were now engaged, planning a small garden wedding behind the hotel. No fancy halls, George joked. Just real people and real love. As Richard helped him straighten his tie on the big day, George said softly, "You saved me, Rich. Not just from a bad marriage, but from losing myself." Richard smiled. That's what family does. The real kind, not the kind that buys respect. And with that, they walked into the sunlight. Two brothers, wiser, stronger, and finally free.